Right. Hey, good morning, Facebook. This is Jim Blythe, Veterans Impact Show. Joining me, my good friend, Captain Marc Liebman. He was a SAR rescue pilot. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about flying helicopters in Vietnam. And you want to have fun and an exciting experience? Fly with the Navy. So we'll be right with you in just a second when we go live on our broadcast, Veterans Impact Show. Welcome to the Veterans Impact Show, where we continue the mission of highlighting veterans and service organizations who continue to serve our community and our nation. We're brought to you by Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Don't worry, retire happy. Welcome aboard. What a great day we've got. I am so thrilled. I want to introduce, which he comes on a lot because he's a very dear friend and a great author, writer, speaker, Marc Liebman, Captain, U.S. Navy retired. Marc, welcome aboard, buddy.
Thanks much, shipmate. Excuse me. Anyway, it's fun. It's always fun to do these kinds of shows.
I know it is, and today is going to be a lot of fun because we're going to talk about one of my favorite things, which is flying. But we're going to talk about flying in a helicopter and what you did, not only in Vietnam, but in the Navy. And one of the things that really kind of grabbed me was you said about halfway through, you realized something about what was going on and what you were doing. So let's start off and tell that, and then we'll tell the rest of the story so everybody knows kind of a little bit about what your motivation was.
Well, I always wanted to be a military aviator. My dad was in the Air Force. I went Navy because of two things. One, they guaranteed me flight training, which the Air Force wouldn't in 1968, or actually before then. And then the other reason is I wound up with more longevity, which from a pay perspective is a good deal. So I got halfway through the training command for reasons that we'll get into the story later. I wound up after I landed on the quick carrier qualified, being told I was going to go fly helicopters.
Mm-hmm.
And I went in and I said, "Hey, I don't want to do that." And they said, "Ensign, you have a choice. You can DOR, drop on request, in other words, quit, or go fly helicopters." Well, I went and flew helicopters. So I was pretty angry because I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I was tops in my group. I had all the grades. The only reason I didn't go to jets at a primary is because the T2 program, T2s were having problems and they shut it down for a month or so. So we went off and flew T28s. Anyway, so about halfway through my career, it suddenly dawned on me that I was doing a lot of things that are really interesting that not a lot of people got to do.
Absolutely.
And so it became fun. And so that evolution, even though I'm still a bit of a frustrated fighter pilot, by the time my career ended, or at least the flying part of my Navy career ended, I realized that I did a lot of really cool things. And the helicopter community is much smaller than the rest of the communities in the air, at least it was at the time. And again, the things I did were different, unusual. Some were kind of dangerous. Most were fun, but I think probably one of the most gratifying things was we did a lot of humanitarian work. And that, from a psychological perspective, when you land in a clearing in a typhoon ravaged island, bring in water, food, medical equipment, whatever, and you see the people's faces light up.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you're sitting here in the cockpit, because everybody's unloading the helicopter, but you can see the people. And then when you come back the second time and the third time, they bring you stuff, food generally, but sometimes trinkets, but most often food, and just they want to shake your hand. So, like I said, that's good for the mind.
Well, Marc, I remember quite well you guys picking up pilots who went on the drink.
Yeah, that was a primary job.
That was your primary job. And one of the things that you did, which was so amazing to me when we first got to know each other, was you flew off of some of what we call the destroyers, the cruisers, and that's where your rotors are just within very. So let's back up though, just a second, and let's talk about you got going. We've talked about what you learned, but tell us a little bit more about flight school and how you got started.
So 1968, I graduated from college, And I go to Pensacola, and you start off with a thing called pre-flight. As I remember, it was 4 weeks long. It's ground school, it's introduction to aviation or aircraft systems, navigation, weather, and you have everybody in the group. You have the NFOs, naval flight officers who sit in the back seats of certain airplanes, aviators, and the air intelligence officers. And again, at the end of that, the NFOs go to the NFO school, and the pilots go into primary flight training. So I flew the T-34B, which had 225 horsepower as a piston engine airplane. I had flown it learning to fly. In fact, that's what I got. I flew most. Actually, I flew the A model, but that's what I flew most as a kid. So I had about 40 hours in it, and I didn't tell anybody because they tell you if you do, they change the curriculum on you. So I plumbeted a few flights in the beginning. And so anyway, so I soloed in that right on schedule, got really good grades. So coming out of that, I said, hey, I said, I want to, they said, ask you when you want to go, jets, helos, or multi-engine. And I said, I want to go jets. I want to fly fighters. They said, great. And so I put that in, and then the list comes out. Sorry, as I said earlier, they were having problems with the T2s in Meridian, which is where pretty much everybody went for basic jet. So they said, hey, we don't want to have you sitting in a BOQ for a couple months till we sort this out. Go to T28s at BT2. After you CQ on the boat, if you do well, you go right to Corpus for advance and jets. I said, great, I'm in. Because now I got to fly a T28, which is pretty close in performance. Well, it's actually better performance than a F4F Wildcat, which flew in World War II. It's about 3/4 of the way to an F4U Corsair or a P-51 or a P-47. So now I got to fly one of these things. And
combat type plane.
Yeah, right. So
have fun.
And of course, at the end of that, had really good grades. Went out to Barron Field, and then we did our caracals. And I will tell you, of the things in my naval aviation or time in the training command as a student, the day I went out to the boat, I can remember vividly everything I did from the moment I walked into the briefing room at Barron Field, and they said, hey guys, today's the day. We're going to go out and do a quick FCLP hop, which is like a half hour. You get 6 landings, and then you come back, refuel, and boom, on the way to the boat you go. So we went out there, and I just stayed in the pattern, and I did my what they call low pass to a wave off, then a touch and go. I got 6 traps, and they said, as I came off the end, I said, come back around. So I did a 7th trap, and apparently the talker who's recording the grades miscounted the number of traps because I was only supposed to get 6. So I got a 7th trap, and then they sent me up, and I then led because of the sequence, led flight of 4 back to Barron Field. Came in 325 feet, did a break, land, touchdown. The LSO was out there, said, great landing, Liebman, the number of the airplane, which was 506. And taxied in, we did a debrief, and then they go, because each pass is graded. And so each of my 7 passes, the LSO went through this, and he kept saying, okay, 3 points. And so I wound up with like about, I had 1 pass that was not, I won't say perfect, because you don't get, there's no such thing as a perfect pass, but I had really good grades. In fact, I wound up being.
Wait a minute. No such thing as a perfect pass. Mark, anytime you land a plane and walk away, there ain't nothing wrong with that. I'm sorry, I had to interrupt you.
Yeah, that's true. But so anyway, so they showed the rankings the next morning, and there I am as the top hook, and I'm thinking I'm going to go jets. So then it waited a while, and then they post the assignments, and there I am. That in fact is me and the next 25 guys. There were 30 guys that went to the boat, and the next 25 guys are all going helos. And I said, so I'm pissed. Hey, I want to go to
unhappy,
pissed. And so I walk over to the admin officer and say, hey, and knock on the door of this lieutenant commander. I'm an ensign in 01. Lieutenant commander's in 04. So I got a major in the Army and the Air Force and Marine Corps. And what do you want, ensign? I said, sir, I think there's some kind of mistake. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I saw the list and where we're going, and I'm going helos, and supposedly the guy at the top of the class gets his first choice, which mine is jets. And he looked at me and says, ensign, the Navy needs helicopter pilots. You have a choice. You can DOR, drop on request, or you can go fly helos. And I went, but I. And I stood there, I tried to argue with him, and he just looked at me and said, go.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of like when you're talking to your parents, the next phrase you're not going to really like.
No, I've been there, done that. Although my parents were great, but I did the same thing in the Navy. I got to choose what I did, and I was maintenance administration. So I started with A4s, but I ended up with helos. So I can relate a lot to what you're talking about. So what did your family feel like when they found out you were going helicopters and then you're getting ready to go to Vietnam? I mean, hello.
Well, they didn't. The Vietnam came later.
Yeah.
So let me finish the story. So I went off to Ellison Field, flew the TH-57, which is a Bell Jet Ranger, with orange and white paint on it and not much else different. Oh, and Navy radios. And so at the time, the Navy was advanced helicopter was an H-34, which was a piston engine helicopter, and they were just starting Hueys. And they said to me, "Hey, Liebman, you want to go fly? You want to fly Hueys or the H-34?" And I said, I don't want to fly the H-34 because I had seen movies, pictures of Hueys. Huey looks cool. What I didn't know is that we were getting Hueys that had come back from Vietnam, and supposedly they were coming out of the front end of the Army overhaul facility in Corpus Christi. But the first dozen or so were basically, we flew to Corpus Christi, picked one off the ramp, and flew it back to Pensacola. We fly it for a while, and then we deliver it back to be overhauled. So we had airplanes that were, had bent skids.
Oh, Lord.
They all had bullet holes in them. They had very little. They had stripped the avionics out of them. So all we had was a radio and a transponder. And a lot of them only had instruments on one side because the Army flew them single pilot. And so I flew those. We didn't do about a quarter of the syllabus. To this day, I've never done an external load, and that's part of the syllabus. We did a lot of instrument flying. We did some cross country. Our cross countries would typically go to Corpus Christi and come back to Pensacola, take some guys down there, or go or be taken down there and bring a helicopter back. So anyway, so by this time I'm madly in love with the woman who's been my wife for 54 years. I got to make sure I got the number right correct because she's going to listen. Anyway, so I'm madly in love with the woman who becomes my wife. I get sent, and now I'm getting ready to go off to Vietnam. So my father was kind of cool. My mother said, "Wait a second, helicopters, they fly low and slow, and they can always set down." Well, yeah, not quite true, Mom. We'll talk about that later. My dad went, "Oh my God, they're flying. He's going to fly helicopters in Vietnam," because by this time, the only people that knew about helicopters in Vietnam was the Army and the Marine Corps, and they were getting a crap shot out of them.
Oh, yeah.
And so I go through the RAG, get assigned, RAG being replacement air group. I was go through training, get assigned to a det. I'm going to Vietnam. The night I leave, okay, my wife sits down and
now you guys had just gotten married.
We'd been married, got married in November 9th. And I left in the middle of December.
Oh, boy.
So she sits down and she watches a movie called The Bridges at Toko Ri. It's a great movie about combat search and rescue. Okay. And in fact, there's also so much. It's based on Michener's book. It's a very good book about the U.S. Navy and the culture of naval aviation. However, one of the heroes is Mickey Rooney, and he's a helicopter pilot flying SAR, combat SAR. And guess what? He gets killed in the end.
Gets killed in the end.
And my bride freaks out. I didn't know this till I saw her halfway through the cruise or through my deployment. And she told me the story, and she was crying and, "Oh my God, you're going to get killed." But she was really stoic about it because it didn't reveal any of it in her letters or tapes.
Oh, wow.
But when we first saw each other 6 months later, so I flew H2s, I flew H3s. I have a fair amount of time in the H60. I've flown pretty much I've flown the single engine H2 A and B. I've flown the H2C, the HH2D, and the UH2C. I'm trying to get these things right. And then I've got a lot of time in the H3, the HH3A, the SH3A, the SH3G, H, and D. And then I've got some time in the SH60B, and then a lot more time in the HH60H, which was the last helicopter I flew in the Navy.
One of the things that you flew the SH-3 Alpha, right? Or the SH-3, the big mother, we call
Yeah,
it.
it was actually an HH3A, but yeah,
Okay. That's the plane for people to go, what are they talking about? That's the plane the president uses. That's Marine Corps One or whatever
a
they call
version of it.
a
Yeah, it's
version of it.
stretched and it's
Yeah.
got bigger engines.
But it's a big thing. Now, the other thing you're talking about, the Hookie Took, the UH-2, that
Yeah.
was a plane built up in Bloomfield, Connecticut. It was called a Sea Sprite, and it was a twin engine plane, and it was used primarily for SAR. There was
Yeah,
some,
shipboard SAR and some
yeah,
combat SAR.
and that's what I'd worked with, and that's what I dealt with. And those things had, I mean, they had clamshell doors in the front. We're going to talk about this a little later, but they never sealed. So when you guys flew through a storm, which we had so many rainstorms in the Gulf of Tonkin, it was ridiculous. You lost all your instruments.
Yeah, the first thing generally would go would be the attitude gyro, and what would happen is the rain would come through the clamshell doors, and then the humidity and the water would get into the cannon plugs and start popping fuses.
Oh man.
Or get into the wiring, and so you start losing stuff. So within about 15-20 minutes you were partial panel, which meant the only thing you had that worked was the pedostatic instruments, radar, the altimeter, vertical speed indicator, and
your backside, because you flew by the seat of your pants.
not
Mark,
really, but so let me tell you a funny story. So one of the things I had is a backup attitude gyro. Was I would had a large washer on a piece of string, and I tie it to the wet compass, and it would hang down, and I could tell which direction, because it's moving opposite the direction the helicopter is moving. So you're flying partial panel, which we all trained to learn how to do, and I actually got really good at it. Even when before I quit flying in the civilian world, I would practice partial panel flying all the time. And so, but that was a way to give me kind of a sense of what the helicopter was doing. But yeah, so when we start losing all this stuff, the first thing we do is try to find area where there's no rain, and going down is generally not the place to go, because that's where the rain's going. And in the Gulf and Southeast Asia, it's typically low ceilings and rain. But the bad news in helicopters, the higher you go, the less efficient the helicopter becomes, and you start losing. It just becomes more difficult to fly.
Well, let me make a point, though. You've talked about a great deal of training. The Navy training is unbelievable. And the tremendous amount of knowledge that you have and experience that you have took you to places to be flying off of cruisers and destroyers. But it was so much knowledge and so much experience that you had, which was truly amazing. But on top of that, Mark, you got to have a lot of wisdom. You got to be able to discern what you got to do. And you were talking about your own jury rig deal. This is part of aviation. This is what makes it exciting. So if people want to know what an exciting career is, go into naval aviation. Trust me. All right, we're going to be right back after these words from all of our partners. You're listening to the Veterans Impact Show, and I'm Jim Blythe. And one of the things we need to do when we come back is talk about who's sponsoring us. So we'll be right back after these words from all of our partners. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. Man, I'm having fun with Marc Liebman, Captain U.S. Navy. We're talking about flying, one of my favorite things, but I want to stop for just a second and say my company, Fairway, which is so veteran-oriented, we have the American Warrior Initiative. We've given away over $1 million worth of service dogs with our company, Fairway Independent Mortgage. I do reverse mortgage lending. I'm a specialist, and my MLS number is 311548, and our corporate one is 2289. I got to tell you, Fairway is one of the top companies in the nation, and I am so thrilled to be there, and they pay for this program. So thank you, Fairway, and thank you, everybody who supports me and supports veterans. You want to know how to do a VA loan? Call Fairway. You want to know how to do a reverse mortgage? Call Fairway. You want to buy a home? Call Fairway. We'll help you. Now, let's go back to the really fun stuff, which I love flying. I got vaccinated with avgas many, many years ago and jet fuel. I had a chance. You talk about crazy things. I had a chance to fly and qualified to fly in the back seat of the TA-4 and flew quite a bit up in Fallon, Nevada. What a great thing for a 20-year-old to sit in a jet fighter. What a great thing. You're 21, 22 years old. You're flying a helicopter. And before long, you got so much experience, you got to be the dead officer in charge.
Yeah, so one of the great things about the Navy's Helo community is the fact that we often operate in small debts. Typically, if you're on the back end of a destroyer, it's 1 or 2 helicopters and anywhere from 2 pilots to 4 or 5 pilots and maybe 40 enlisted people. And the officer in charge, when I was a JO, was typically a brand new lieutenant, which is an 03, or a lieutenant select, which means you're really an 02, lieutenant junior grade, but you've been selected for lieutenant. And suddenly there you are, and you are, if you're on a small boy, you're equivalent of a department head, which are 04s, lieutenant commanders, sometimes commanders, depending on the size ship, and you're reporting to the captain. But a lot of times I was on the back end of a destroyer with a debt, and my report, operationally, I was reporting to somebody else, and the CO of the ship was kind of my airbase. But the point about this is you get, particularly in the Navy Helo community, you get lots of leadership opportunities very early in your career. And that is, besides being fun, so being a test of your skills, it's very educational. I can't tell you the number of times I've had senior officers look at me and I'd say, look, they'd say, I can do this. I think we can do this, but I've never done it before. And there's some obstacles. And the standard answer I got was lieutenant commander, commander. I even got told this is an 06, captain, go figure it out. And so there you are. Okay. So we're in the Black Sea. I'm operating off the back end of a destroyer, actually a cruiser. And we're sent out to go take pictures of a brand new ship that is coming out of Sevastopol. It's called the Moskva. And it's a helicopter carrier. It's the first one that the Russians or Soviets deployed. And my mission was to go take photographs of it. Good photographs. Now, I'm not the photographer. I've got a photo mate in the back, a Navy photographer. And so we go find the Moskva. It's conducting flight operations. And so I pull alongside. Now, NATOPS, the Navy's publications about flying around ships, says when you're flying around a foreign ship, you're supposed to be at least 500 feet abeam or 1,000 feet above. Well, that doesn't give you a really good place to take pictures. So,
oh no, you didn't.
So yours truly slides along the Moskva, which is steaming along at probably 15 knots, and I'm within 100 feet of the side of the ship, or the rotor tips of the rotor blades, about 100 feet, and the photographer's in the back clicking away. He's got a 200 millimeter lens, and he's having a great time. And we're going up and down the side of the ship. We went around on the other side, took sides. He's taking pictures of the officers who are looking at us with binoculars. And then I said, "Hey, you want to see?" He said, "Can you get some good pictures of the flight deck?" I said, "Hey, yeah, sure." So they got these 6 Hormones, which is a Ka-25. It's a Soviet helicopter. They're out doing touch and goes. So I joined the flight pattern. So I'm position myself, come back to the beam position, drop the gear, the H2, come back around, and before I crossed over the deck, I veered off, so I did not fly over the deck, and I went up the side and then rejoined the pattern. And the Moskva has this big hangar door in the back, and so he's sitting there. He's seen that thing. He apparently we adjusted the f-stop so because I saw the pictures. Everything's blacked out, but you can see inside the Moskva's. It was an elevator. That's all that was in there really, and some stuff on the side. But anyway, so I did this. The second time I came around, they fired flares at me. The third time I came around, I could see one of the gun turrets tracking me, and I said, "I don't think this is a good idea. We're going to leave." But then we went, and we came back. But the cool thing is that I was told to get good pictures. Okay, you can't get good pictures 500, 1,000 feet away with a 200 millimeter lens. Even I know that, and I'm not a photographer. Okay, so I asked the photographer back. I said, "What do you need to get good photos?" "Close, sir." I said, "Define close." 100 feet. Done.
Whoa! I bet the Russians were having a ball watching you guys. Did they smile?
No, well, they were waving at us and shaking their fist at us. I flew formation alongside one of the hormones, and I waved at the guy. The guy waved at me, and then anyway. So well, I'll
Well,
tell
you
you.
you had a
I'll
lot
tell
of
you the
fun.
yeah. I won't tell you the R-rated part of this.
No, don't tell me that, but I got to
I'll
tell
tell
you,
you.
I'm bet you there was also some serious discussion somewhere because the Russians probably filed 2 or 3 complaints.
Oh, they
But
did.
and stuff like that happens. Stuff like
And
that happened in the Navy. The flying a helicopter is a lot more complicated than flying a fixed wing plane.
correct.
I'm a fixed wing pilot. We actually have a Beach Bonanza, a B-35. We have a Grumman Tiger. These are wonderful planes to fly, but there's so much difference in flying a helicopter. And a helicopter is such an exciting thing to fly. You know, you see those pictures of them doing a road recce, running down a river or whatever. There's a lot that goes on, and it's an exciting thing to do, but it's also dead gum dangerous.
That it is.
And a lot more education, a lot more learning, and a lot more skill. You want to know about skill? Then become a Navy pilot. We're going to talk more about that here in a few minutes. We're going to be coming back from a break. Listen, we are so thankful to have Fairway part of this broadcast. So go take a look at us, fairwaymortgage.com. And this is Jim Blythe, and I'm with Fairway, and I am the voice of this broadcast, Veterans Impact Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show. And thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. What a great day. We're talking about my favorite thing with one of my great friends, Captain Marc Liebman. But let me stop for a second, Mark, because I keep interrupting you. But yeah, we're going to talk about that. But I want to talk about your books. When I read your first book, Cherubs 2, I called you up and I said, this ain't fiction. Didn't I?
Correct.
And I said, you talk about being on the O-boat, the Oriskany. And I was there with HC 1.6. And I'm like, wow, Mark. So your book, Cherubs 2, then Big Mother 40, which you're talking about, the SH3. These are one of the most delightful adventure books. Of course, obviously, I was there and I was in the squadron that handled them. But then you've gone on to write so many books that are really terrific. Your Age of Sail books, your cyber security, your all of these books. People can go to find you at Marc Liebman, MarcLiebman.com. These books are great. They're on Amazon, your bestseller list.
Yeah, so the books are all on Amazon. I'm in the process of loading all the books on. It's called Books to Read or Digital to Digital website, and they're now available on 18 different. I think it's 18. It's some number more than 2 distributors. But most people buy my books either buy them from Amazon or Barnes and Noble, and obviously they're there. They're available in 3 or 4 different electronic formats, as well as paper copies. And 3 of the books, Big Mother 40, Cherubs 2, and Render Harmless, are now audiobooks.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more of the audiobooks coming. It just takes a while. So yeah, they're fun. They're as I tell people, there's more fact than fiction in some of them. They all have segments or fictionalized versions of stuff that I did, or even stuff from my family. And or in case of Render Harmless, I grew up in Germany, so there's a lot of stuff from my childhood in there brought forward to the period in time. This is the way I kind of fictionalized it. But anyway, so yeah, they're fun. 5 of them become Amazon bestsellers. I have a 13th book coming out. Knock on wood, hopefully next month. It's called Insidious Dragon. We talked about that last time. And next month, I think we're going to talk about it a lot because it's a counterterrorism novel. And then The Age of Sail have become a labor of love. It's led to a lot of interesting things, one of which is my blog, which is about the American Revolution in the year up to the year 1815, when we fought our second war for independence. It's called the War of 1812. And so yeah, it's fun. It keeps me out of honeydews.
I got to tell you, I've enjoyed them. They're exciting. And then you came and you were on the program and we spoke about the Revolutionary War and the history and all the things that the Navy did during the Revolutionary War, which really caused us to win a war against the biggest power in the world at that time. And
And
there
then
were a lot of very revolutionary things that they did during the revolution. So I love reading your books. You also do a lot of public speaking.
correct.
So if you want to have a great public speaker, as a matter of fact, you're going to be at Navy League this next week,
Yep.
and I'm looking forward to it. Diane and I are in there. We're bringing a lot of cool people.
Yeah. Can I give the topic?
Yeah, please do.
So it has nothing to do with the American Revolution or Vietnam or flying helicopters. I've become an amateur historian because I don't have any formal training as a historian. And it's called Russia and Putin at the Crossroad. It has very little to do with the war of the Ukraine, but it's what I'm trying to do is get people to start thinking about what happens post Putin.
Oh my goodness gracious, that's important. I bet you get to do that to some of the other deals that you and I go to. Now, let's go and talk about actually flying the Hookie 2. Let's talk about that because a lot of people don't understand what makes a helicopter fly and how that works. So go into some detail so people can get a sense of the excitement, the fun, and the knowledge that's required.
Well, the first big thing about a helicopter that's different from a fixed wing airplane is that if you move one control, you have to move the other two. There is no just move one and something happens and wait. One thing causes the other something else to happen. So, and I tell people if you can pat your head and move your hand in a circle one direction and do your stomach in the other direction at the same time and move your feet independently, you can fly a helicopter. So that's number one. Number two, the cockpit sort of looks like a fixed wing airplane and was done that deliberately. But there's a thing on the left side of the helicopter, or the cockpit's called the collective. And what it does is it changes the pitch of the rotor blades all at the same time, depending on where it is as it's going around around in a circle. So the rudder pedals change the pitch of the tail rotor blade, so it acts like a rudder, but gives you directional control laterally. And then the cyclic stick, what it really does is it moves changes the way the pitch of the rotor blades in different parts of the cycle as it goes around. So if you push the stick forward, the nose goes down and the helicopter goes forward. If you push the cyclic to the left or right, it goes sideways. If you pull back, it slows up. So the collective does two things. One, it gives you more power or less power. So if you push on the rotor blades, that means you're changing the pitch, but it also requires more power because it's quite often that it's taking a bigger bite out of the air. So you have to add power. Now, in modern helicopters with digital fuel control systems and even some of the analog ones that I flew with, that power compensation was sort of automatic. And the H2 was not nearly as good as it was in the H3 and the H2As when we only had a single engine. You never had enough power. In fact, I used to tell people that the big difference between the H2A and B and the C is, besides the fact that C had two engines, was in the H2 you had barely enough power to turn the rotor blades, and the H2 C and D models you had enough power to unscrew the rotor blades. In other words, you could literally over torque the transmission and cause the rotor system to come off. So the controls are while they look the same, they act and do things that are different. Now, I have gone from fixed wing to rotary wing back and forth several times, a lot of times during my flying career. It's not hard once you're proficient at both.
Yeah.
Okay? But helicopters are dynamically unstable like most fourth generation fighters. If you have an emergency in a helicopter, and I tell people a helicopter is 30 to 40,000 parts flying in close formation, and you hope two don't have a midair. But in a helicopter, you're always flying at lower altitudes. High altitude, we used to kid people that above 1,000 feet, helicopter pilots get nosebleeds. So we 1,000 feet is high in a helicopter, not high, but that's typical transit speed. So, but more often, most of my helicopter flying, particularly at sea, is at 500 feet to 200 to 500 feet. And that was pretty much day and night. That's where we operated. So your margin for error If you're not good on instruments at night, you can fly into the water. If you have an emergency, you have very little time to react. And so Jim had asked me to talk about autos. Can I do that now?
Yeah.
Okay. So
And let me explain. What an auto is an auto rotation. When they lose the engine, and that's about the only good thing you can have happen bad in a helicopter, they've got a way of getting down to the ground that will leave you breathless. So explain it.
breathless is not a word I would use because I would be holding my breath. But okay, so you're trundling along in your helicopter. Let's say it's an H3, which weighs, to give you an idea, max takeoff weight's right around 20,000 pounds. Typical operating rate with half fuel, you're down around the 17,000 pounds. So in an auto rotation, people think helicopters will, oh yeah, I just land, auto rotate, land on a field or on a parking lot. Well, that's true. But the fact of the matter is helicopters don't go very far in an auto. And in fact, if you have to do an auto rotation, you are looking at where you're going to land between your feet. Okay. So the second thing that most people don't understand, that this mythical H3 that I just talked about will come down at around 6,000 feet per minute. So if you're 1,000 feet, you have 12 seconds before you hit the ground. So in that
That's not
12
a
seconds,
lot. That's not a lot of
yeah.
time.
So here's what you have to do in those 12 seconds. Assuming you've suddenly had a dual engine failure and oh my God. Okay, so we've gotten past the oh my God. You immediately lower the collective, drop the nose to get, or raise the nose to get to the best auto rotation airspeed, which is 70 knots. Okay, now hopefully you get there quickly. Faster is better than slower, but let's assume that you're somewhere around 70 knots. By now you're down to about 300 feet, at which point you start raising the nose to bleed off some of the airspeed because you don't want to land at 70 knots or faster. Can ruin your whole day. So now you start bleeding off the airspeed and the helicopter starts skimming along. You do not raise the collective because the rotor blades have generated a fair amount of inertia. And as soon as you raise the collective, you start causing the blades to change, which means that they start to slow down. And when you get below a certain RPM, the blades are not generating enough lift, and you're going to come down like a stone. So somewhere around 150 feet, you start dishing it out, and you start letting down around 40 feet. Okay, you start raising those. You want to get to below 5 to 10 knots, and then you're raising the collective slowly, because once you get to the point where you're running out of inertia, you're coming down. So it's not good to run out of inertia at 10 to 15 feet above the ground because you're going to fall. It's just like jumping off a ladder. So you try to do a run-on landing at 5 knots, and you're bleeding this thing off. And this is why this 12 to 15 seconds is why you see so many helicopters rolled up in a ball when they've tried to auto rotate, because it happens really fast. Now, here's the good news. Back when I was flying H2s, H3s, engine failures were not common. Auto rotations were not common, but we practiced them all the time. Today, the H60s, which is popular in the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, yeah, they practice them. They teach kids how to do them, but the likelihood of having to do a full auto with no engine power is slim. Now, they're twin engine helicopters. If you have a single engine helicopter, like in the civilian world, you have an engine failure, you're going down. But so my point is the emergencies that you see in helicopters today are fewer and far between than they were when I was still flying, which is helicopters was in the 1980s.
Well, think about this for a minute, okay? World War II, they didn't have helicopters, and that was ended in 1945. Barely. Barely. Korea was really starting to use helicopters, and that was in the 1950s.
Yep.
Here we are in Vietnam, 1968, 69, and I was on the carrier in 69 with the UH-2. The amount of time for the technology to come forward wasn't a great deal of time, and the technology came forward. So the helicopters we've got today have got 50 years plus worth of technological development.
Yeah, the big developments early on was the replacement of the piston engine with the gas turbine. So a T58, which was in the H2 and the H3 and a bunch of other helicopters, generated, depending on which model you had, between 1,250 and 1,700 horsepower, and it weighed 198 pounds.
Yeah.
An R1820 in the front end of an H34 is almost 1,000 pounds. So that's number one. You have more power lighter weight. The second thing was the use of composites and rotor blades and structures. And then the third thing was the computerization or the digitization of the control systems. So we went from totally analog hydraulic with no computers in the H2 and the H3 to much more sophisticated stuff in the modern helicopter. But again, the fundamentals of flying a helicopter haven't changed. It's just the fact that they've gotten far more reliable and also more capable. Here's the other weird thing: is they haven't got much faster.
No. All right. What's your max speed for the typical military helicopter?
Well, so theoretically the H3 could go 144 knots, and the only time you'd ever see that is going straight down. Typically, 120 was a good thing. We'd cruise somewhere between 90 and 110. The older they got, we had to slow down because of
Well,
the
make it relative. Okay, a 172, 100, 109, 110, maybe miles an hour. Our Grumman Tiger that we have, maybe 135 to 40 miles an hour. The Beach Bonanza that we have will do 170.
70. So
And the new one we're getting our hands on will do better than that. But you're talking about, though, with a helicopter a lot slower and a lot lower. So
yes.
you got tremendously different. Now, the maintenance requirements for a helicopter is so much higher.
Yep.
You made a joking statement about 40,000 parts flying together and you pray that they don't have a collision. There's so many things that constantly have to be maintained in a helicopter, especially a shipboard helicopter.
Yeah, so you're, besides battling wear and tear, and other things that, stress and stuff like that, you're battling corrosion because salt air is horribly corrosive. The early helicopters had a lot of magnesium in them, and magnesium and salt water just
They don't work together
don't
well.
work together at all. The other amazing thing I want to tell about is the people who maintained the helicopters that I flew in the Navy generally were high school graduates. They would go through boot camp, go to we called A school, and they'd show out. So they're 19, 20 years old. And if these guys do it right, everything's cool. Guys don't put a part in correctly, don't put the safety wire on correctly, use the wrong part, don't torque it down to to within limits, you're dead.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to tell you about, because I wasn't an enlisted man, but I was in administration, I helped those guys. Those guys worked so hard to get it right because they knew if they didn't get it right, you'd get it in the end, which was not an acceptable situation.
Yeah, because they're your shipmates.
And so basically, those guys were tremendous in terms of what they did. Now, where in the world can you go at 18, 19 years old and get that kind of technical hands-on proficiency, especially in environments that we were in on shipboard? You got to be resourceful.
Yep.
Employers today are looking for those kind of veterans.
Yeah, so the Navy is really good about teaching kids leadership early on and giving them usable skills, both dealing with others, technical skills, leadership skills, interpersonal, whatever, early on. And it starts in boot camp. I mean, I've got a step grandson who is now in E6 in the Navy. He's a intercommunications system technician, and he works on both aircraft carriers and other areas. And then I've got a son a grandson who's now in boot camp. He's going to be a SEAL.
Oh, wow.
Hopefully, knock on wood.
Hey, then you get to go see him in Coronado.
Yeah, he's got a long way to go.
He's got a long way to go. Let me tell you something. The Navy is an exciting place. I'm third generation Navy myself. We're talking about exciting things, especially for young men and women. For you old sea dogs who are listening in, you go, I remember this, I remember that. Pass this on to the next generation. Let these kids know there's exciting opportunities. There's exciting opportunities for leadership, and you're going to have adventures that you can't ever imagine. You're going to have opportunities that are unbelievable that everybody else get passed by. So take a look at the Navy, take a look at the Army, take a look at the Marine Corps, take a look at the Air Force, Coast Guard. Let me tell you, it's all out there. So we'll be right back. This is Veterans Impact.
Let's talk about it.
Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show. And thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. I'm just having too much fun talking with Marc Liebman. Hey, go to Marc Liebman, MarcLiebman.com. And let me tell you something, you're going to see some fabulous books. You want to have a great speaker for your organization, talking about leadership, talking about all these things, but you want to read some great books, go read Cherubs or read
Cherubs 2.
Cherubs 2 or Big Mother 40, because let me tell you, it's fiction, but there's a whole lot of fact in there. All right, let's talk about what you were just saying to me of leadership.
Yeah, so again, I come back to one of the reasons why the helicopter community is a little bit unique in the Navy, but this is true pretty much throughout the Navy, at least the aviation community, is that the helo community operates a lot of time in DETs or small units. So you graduate boot camp, you go to A school, you're now an E4, and you could be the sole mechanic in a 12-man helo det. So your responsibility is the engines of that particular helicopter. But even then, as you're advancing in the Navy, not only do you get far more responsibility early on, but you get to go places and do things that, again, not everybody gets to do. So again, I'll come back to humanitarian operations. So when we would go do humanitarian operations, so one of the first things we would fly ashore, besides food and water, is the corpsman on the ship, and sometimes the doctors. But we would ask our guys to go to volunteer. So obviously the primary role is maintaining the helicopter, but there are a lot of times they would go ashore and they would help rebuild hospitals or houses and stuff like this, or create temporary shelters. It's extremely gratifying. The other thing is besides being able to go places and do things, there are post enlistment, first enlistment, and then obviously retirement benefits that you cannot get anywhere. I tell kids, and it's hard for you when you're 18 or 19 to understand this, but the GI Bill basically will now pay for your college education or a trade school education.
And you can buy a home using a VA loan.
Okay, so I'm going to get to that.
One
so
of the best.
VA loans, and then more importantly, if you stay in and you retire, either as a reservist or as an active duty person, it can be a combination. There are people like me and my son and everyone else who did active duty and reserve. But once you get your retirement letter, you now have what's called TRICARE for life. And the first time you see what it costs for, or they deduct what it costs for your health care benefits for an employer, and realize that when you turn 60 and you're eligible for TRICARE for life, this is a huge benefit. And plus the fact the pension, whatever it is, it shows up in your account every month the day you die. And then the day, then if you're married, your spouse gets 60% of it. So these are benefits that you cannot get in the civilian world. They just don't come close to it. And so anyway, so besides the experience and the training, there are post enlistment or post retirement benefits that are literally priceless. And I just thought I'd bring that up.
And let me tell you something. The leadership, the people that I have met and known, it's just been amazing. Of all ranks, all the way up to flag. Amazing about what they are doing in the community. And that's one of the purposes of this program, to talk about what veterans like you are doing in the community. What you're doing is you're writing great books, you're speaking, you're educating, you're showing young people what some of the great things are about the military and what they can do. A lot of people go, oh, I'm scared to death of the military. I'm going to get wounded. I'm going to come back being carried over somebody's shoulder. That's a infinitesimally small percentage of what happened. It does happen, but you can get hit in an automobile accident and get just as messed up.
Yeah,
I've got a good friend that's got that problem right now.
I hate to tell you that, but there are corpsmen there are pararescue men and corpsmen in the U.S. military I would trust more than I trust a lot of doctors.
Oh yeah,
particularly in an emergency situation. But yeah, the risk part of it, yes. If you're flying, it's dangerous, or it's more dangerous than sitting in an office all day. But then again, the psychic or psychological benefits of doing something that you really love, that's unique and different. And oh, by the way, you're going to meet people who will become friends for life. The guy I flew with first in Vietnam is still to this day my best friend in the world. My wife and his ex-wife would tell you that he and I can communicate by grunting.
Well, hey, listen.
Because we spent hours, days, weeks living in the same room in the same cockpit, and we just know each other. But we became really, really close friends.
Here's an amazing thing. We're going in November to a reunion of my squadron, or actually in a latter part of October. VA 163. VA 163 had the highest casualty rate in the Navy during Vietnam.
Yeah.
John McCain was one of my pilots. And those guys I love. I can't wait to see Odie and Mule and everybody. And it's fun to see those guys. And you go back, you know, you and I were children together way back when.
What you're going to do is you're going to see a lot of old people.
Yeah. And I'm going to go, wow. And let me tell you, I think the military is the best thing that ever happened to me in going through boot camp and what I did, because it taught me to be a man. It taught me to be organized, and it taught me how to succeed and dream. And again, you understand, flying attitude is altitude. And the better your attitude is, because you have accomplished great things. You have accomplished things very few people do, because there's so few people who are in the military as compared to the general population. And let me tell you something, it's worth it. So, Mark, I like to end with a prayer, and we're right to that point. So, dearest God in heaven, King of the universe, we are so thankful for you and putting a hedge of protection around our aviators, our sailors, all of our military, our Marines, our Army, those on the ground, those in the air, and those at sea. So, dear God, we are so thankful that you protect them and watch over them, and you guide them and lead them. Thank you, God, for leading our veterans so that they can make a big difference in our nation today in a positive way. Thank you for being part of our lives. This we pray in your holy name. Amen. Marc Liebman, thank you for being on board.
Love it. We're going to do it again next month.
We're going to do it again next month. And one of the things that we're going to be doing is more focus on the military family and all that we can do. We're going to be talking about Gold Star families. We're going to be talking about scholarships. Matter of fact, next week, Jeff Galt, and we're talking about scholarships. That's important. The Army Scholarship Foundation, the Navy, what is available to help put your kids through school.
Okay, so I'm going to put a plug in for all the wives.
You bet.
They
and
have
next
the hardest
time,
job.